Do you know that in many African countries, ballot papers are not even printed at home? Think about that for a moment. The very paper that decides who leads a nation, who controls its future, is often printed in Germany or Greece or London or Paris, not in Lagos, not in Nairobi, not in Ouagadougou. It is an astonishing fact, one that raises a haunting question. If a continent cannot even trust itself to print a piece of paper, how can it possibly trust the results written upon it? And here lies the deeper wound. Across Africa, elections are not moments of celebration or peaceful transition. They are moments of fear. They are life-threatening. In South Africa, mobs have attacked fellow Africans. In Uganda, votes are traded for motorcycles and bags of rice. In Kenya, elections years away already ignite tribal divisions. In Sudan and Libya, two governments claim legitimacy at the same time. In too many places, when election season comes, blood is spilled. Why? Why must the simple act of voting, the act that in theory should give dignity and voice to the people, so often bring chaos, fear, and death? Perhaps the answer lies not only in corruption or tribalism, but in something deeper. Africa was never given the chance to design its own systems. The Berlin Conference of 1884 carved borders. The Cold War imposed ideologies. And today, Western capitals still dictate what democracy should look like, even as they themselves cling to monarchies and double standards. But what if Africa could redefine leadership? What if elections were no longer battlefields but true conversations of ideas? What if democracy was not borrowed clothes, but a garment woven from African traditions of governance, dignity, and trust, friends? I invite you to think about these questions with me. Do you believe Africa should continue to follow imported systems, or should it chart its own way forward? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that the truth matters more than the headlines, subscribe now to stay with us on this journey. When the speaker declared that African nations cannot even print their own ballots, he was not exaggerating. He was setting the stage for a sobering tour across the continent, a panorama of crises that reveal how fragile elections have become in Africa. Let us walk through his map of pain step by step. In South Africa, a nation that many once believed would be the model of post-apartheid democracy, the reality is stark. Hospitals, places meant for healing, have become scenes of hostility where some South Africans expel fellow Africans and tell them to go back home. This is not just xenophobia. It is a symptom of elections turning citizens against each other, fueled by the poisonous idea that power belongs only to one group. Move north to Zimbabwe, and you encounter the Mutukazi group who want to carve out their own country. Elections have not united the people. They have deepened divisions to the point where secession feels like the only option. The ballot box, which should knit citizens together, becomes instead a blade that cuts the nation apart. Cross into Zambia, where the death of a former president sparked bitter arguments over whether he should even be buried at home. What should have been a solemn national moment turned into another reminder that politics is never far away, even in death. In Malawi and Tanzania, elections drag on with the same old disputes, accusations of rigging, intimidation, and treason charges against opposition leaders. Just one morning, a letter smuggled from a Tanzanian prison by an opposition figure accused of treason tells us everything. Political competition in these lands can cost you your freedom. In Kenya, elections are still 2 years away, yet already people rise against one another along ethnic lines. That is the scale of mistrust. Violence does not wait for the ballot to be cast. It brews long before poisoning relationships and dividing communities. In Uganda, elections have degenerated into a marketplace. Motorcycles, bags of rice, and t-shirts become the real ballots traded for votes. The election becomes less a choice of leadership than an auction of power where poverty itself is weaponized. Travel further north to Sudan, where chaos reigns. Two presidents now claim legitimacy, and the nation bleeds. In South Sudan, the story is no different. Leaders who once promised unity have plunged their young country into the same old trap: civil war under the banner of elections. The Democratic Republic of Congo shows us another face of this disease. Former presidents face charges in absentia, yet elections continue under clouds of corruption and violence. In the Central African Republic, a president clings to power only because foreign soldiers, this time from Russia, hold the balance. Without them, the streets might decide his fate. Look to Libya, once a wealthy nation, now fractured between two governments, each claiming to be the legitimate authority. Democracy imposed from outside did not heal, it split the country apart. And finally, in the Sahel, in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, elected governments have collapsed under the weight of corruption, insecurity, and disillusion. Military governments now hold power. For some, this feels like betrayal. For others, it feels like the only way to escape the endless cycle of fraudulent elections followed by bloodshed. This grim journey across Africa leaves us with a clear picture. Wherever you turn, the story is the same: elections are not moments of peace, but sparks of violence. Politicians do not treat leadership as service, but as spoils to be won at any cost. And the people, ordinary men and women, are left to fear, to suffer, and sometimes to die. The speaker summarized it with a haunting image. When you see a toad jumping in the daylight, something is after its life. Africa's toad is democracy leaping desperately in broad daylight. Something is always chasing it: tribalism, greed, corruption, or foreign interference. And unless this chase ends, Africans will continue to associate elections not with dignity, but with death. The tension rises when we ask, why are African elections so dangerous? Why is it that every time citizens prepare to vote, fear hangs heavier than hope? This is the point where the speaker took us back in history, showing that today's crises are not isolated. They are the fruits of a poisoned tree planted long ago. He began with 1884, the Berlin Conference, where European powers carved Africa into pieces not for Africans, but for colonial profit. Borders were drawn with rulers and ink, not with respect for tribes, languages, or traditions. That act of division guaranteed that when Africans later tried to govern themselves, they would be trapped in structures designed to fail. Then came the 1960s. Independence swept across the continent, but hope was short-lived. Patrice Lumumba of Congo, democratically elected in 1961, was assassinated within 9 months. Congo has never recovered. In Togo, 1963, Sylvanus Olympio suffered the same fate. Nigeria spiraled into coups by 1967. Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania faced mutinies in 1964, and Uganda collapsed into full dictatorship by 1971. Everywhere you looked, the pattern was clear: leaders who dreamed of an Africa free to design its own destiny were silenced. The message was unmistakable: independence was tolerated, but only within limits. Step too far, and you were removed. The continent internalized a lesson: elections were not about choosing leaders, but about surviving a game whose rules were written in Brussels, London, Washington, or Paris. And then came the Cold War. With the Soviet Union's fall, Africa was told it must accept liberal democracy. Multi-party systems, civil society organizations, constitutions modeled on Europe, all were imposed as conditions for loans, aid, and international legitimacy. The irony: even as Europe preached democracy, it held tightly to monarchies in Britain, Spain, Sweden, and Denmark. Africans were told to abandon their kingdoms, their councils of elders, their indigenous systems of governance, all labeled undemocratic. The climax of the speaker's argument arrived in one simple phrase: "We are wearing borrowed clothes." African nations, he said, dress themselves in democratic garments, stitched abroad, never tailored to their own bodies. The result: those clothes do not fit. They tear at the seams during elections, leaving the continent exposed to violence and chaos. And how do Africans themselves react to this? Too often with resignation or fear. Citizens queue to vote knowing that stones might fly, that rallies might end in blood, that women must wear jeans and running shoes just to survive political gatherings. Opposition leaders brace for jail cells. Families mourn children caught in clashes that should never have happened. The people who should be the heart of democracy instead carry its heaviest burden. But there is also another reaction: a quiet but growing defiance. Intellectuals, clergy, and young Africans whisper the same question: what if we stopped borrowing? What if we crafted governance out of our own values? Values of trust, communal responsibility, and service. The speaker urged his audience to spread a pandemic of good manners, to make virtues as contagious as vice. Because until values change, even machines, even artificial intelligence will only reproduce dishonesty. Internationally, the reactions are layered with hypocrisy. Western governments continue to lecture Africa about democracy while ignoring the violence that their models fuel. Aid agencies punish African nations for experimenting with alternative systems, yet tolerate monarchies and one-party dominance at home. And when African leaders try to break free, whether by nationalizing resources or rejecting imposed constitutions, they often face isolation, sanctions, or worse. The result is a paradox. Africa is trapped between two fears: fear of its own corrupt elites and fear of foreign powers who claim to defend democracy but often undermine it. That is why every election feels like a climax, because it is not only about who wins the presidency, it is about survival sovereignty and the very definition of leadership. The speaker's warning resounded like thunder. As long as elections remain life-threatening, Africans will never trust the process. And without trust, democracy is nothing but paper, often printed in Europe, never at home. The aftermath of Africa's troubled elections is not confined to ballot boxes or political offices. It spills directly into the streets, into homes, into the fabric of everyday life. The consequences are civil, political, and profoundly human. First, there is the erosion of trust. Ordinary citizens no longer believe in the sanctity of the vote. When ballots are printed abroad and results take days or weeks to be counted, people sense manipulation. They ask if Germany, with 82 million people, can count votes in 8 hours. Why does an African country with fewer than 12 million voters need days? The unspoken answer is painful because leaders and systems cannot be trusted. And without trust, democracy collapses into suspicion, conspiracy, and despair. Second, elections poison the civic environment. Violence becomes normalized. Women, who should play a central role in shaping the future, withdraw in fear. The speaker painted a chilling picture. African women attending rallies must wear jeans and running shoes, ready to flee from stones and chaos. The day politics is safe enough for women to arrive in high heels to speak ideas without fear will be the day democracy becomes real. Until then, women remain excluded and half the population's voice is silenced. Third, bribery corrodes the political soul. Bags of rice motorcycles cash and t-shirts replace policy debates. Poverty is weaponized and citizens are transformed into clients of corrupt politicians rather than free decision makers. The result is predictable: leaders enter office not as trustees of the people, but as businessmen repaying investments. Leadership becomes a market transaction, and nations pay the price in stalled progress, misused funds, and growing inequality. Politically, the impact is devastating. African elections too often produce not legitimacy, but instability. Contestants who lose refuse to accept results, and some declare themselves presidents. Coups and counter-coups become the reset button. In Sudan, 2 men claimed the throne. In Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, the ballot gave way to the barracks. For citizens, it means living under a cloud of uncertainty, never knowing if tomorrow's leader will come from the polls or from a tank. And what of institutions, parliaments, courts, universities, churches, mosques? They too suffer. Professors who dare question the system face suspension. Clergy who align with politicians turn pulpits into campaign stages. Traditional leaders are courted with money and construction projects co-opted into defending the very status quo that oppresses their people. When institutions lose independence, society loses its anchors. The civil consequences deepen mistrust between ethnic groups, suspicion between neighbors, and an undercurrent of fear in daily life. Elections meant to unify instead sharpen divisions. The speaker reminded us, elections in Africa give birth to death and violence. That haunting phrase captures the tragedy of a continent where the civic act of choosing leaders has become a civil war in miniature. But perhaps the greatest consequence is the corrosion of hope. Generations grow up believing politics is not about service, but survival. Young people dream not of building nations, but of escaping them. Intellectuals flee or remain silent, fearing reprisals. The continent bleeds not only its best resources, but its best minds. In the end, the civil and political consequences converge into a single truth: Africa cannot continue on this path. To persist is to accept that every election will be a season of mourning. And that is why the call to redefine leadership, not as conquest, but as trust, is not just idealistic. It is necessary for survival. From Washington to Brussels, from Paris to London, the world has always watched African elections with a peculiar double vision. On one hand, Western governments proclaim themselves guardians of democracy, lecturing African nations about free and fair elections. On the other hand, they often look away when violence erupts, so long as their strategic interests remain untouched. This contradiction has shaped Africa's modern political destiny. For the United States, Africa's elections are less about African dignity and more about geopolitical balance. Washington wants stability, but only the kind of stability that secures trade routes, military bases, and resource access. When elections deliver leaders who promise continuity with Western policies, the U.S. applauds. When elections bring leaders who challenge foreign influence, as in Niger, Mali, or Burkina Faso, suddenly those leaders are branded illegitimate, authoritarian, or even threats to democracy. The language is telling. It is less about democracy itself and more about alignment with American interests. Europe, too, plays its part. The European Union funds electoral commissions, provides technical observers, and prints ballots for entire African nations. Yet the same Europe sustains monarchies at home. The United Kingdom, Spain, Denmark, and Sweden proudly maintain royal families, while telling Africa that its traditional kingdoms are undemocratic relics. This hypocrisy is not lost on Africans. They see clearly that what is tolerated in Europe is forbidden in Africa. Globally, the reaction to African elections reveals another uncomfortable truth: the fear of African independence. Whenever an African leader suggests rethinking democracy, global powers grow anxious. They worry less about human rights and more about the possibility of Africa crafting governance rooted in its own culture, governance that cannot be manipulated by foreign aid, foreign loans, or foreign experts. That is why bold moves, whether nationalizing gold in Burkina Faso or questioning multi-party systems in Uganda, trigger waves of condemnation from abroad. The media, too, plays a decisive role. Western headlines focus on chaos, burning tires, street battles, soldiers in fatigues, rarely asking why elections have become war zones. Rarely do they highlight the deeper question: are these systems truly African? By framing every crisis as proof of Africa's failure rather than proof of foreign-imposed models, international media sustains the myth that Africans cannot govern themselves. But there are shifts. Russia and China present alternatives, offering partnerships that do not lecture about democracy. Moscow supplies security. Beijing supplies infrastructure. Critics in the West call this manipulation, yet many Africans view it as liberation from the endless cycle of Western tutelage. Meanwhile, Pan-African leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso push the idea that sovereignty begins with redefining politics itself, moving away from borrowed clothes to garments stitched from African heritage. For older American viewers, the question is pressing: what role should the United States play? Should America continue to dictate Africa's systems from afar, or should it respect the continent's right to experiment, to fail, and to find its own path, just as America once did after its own revolution? The world's gaze on Africa is not neutral. Every election becomes a battleground not only for votes, but for influence. Until that changes, African ballots will remain symbols not of trust, but of tug-of-war between external powers and internal survival. Elections are meant to be milestones of progress, moments when nations pause to choose their future. Yet in much of Africa, they have become seasons of dread. From South Africa's street hostility to Sudan's rival presidents, from Uganda's vote buying to Burkina Faso's military reset, the pattern is unmistakable: ballots bring not peace, but peril. The speaker's words ring painfully true. Elections in Africa give birth to death and violence. The warning is urgent. If Africa continues to wear borrowed clothes stitched in Washington, Brussels, or Paris, the cycle will not end. Each election will remain a battlefield. Each generation will inherit not democracy, but distrust. The costs are civil, women excluded, youth disillusioned. The costs are political institutions, hollowed leaders illegitimate. And the costs are global nations caught in a tug-of-war between East and West, never free to walk their own path. But the future need not be written in blood. There is another way. Leadership can be redefined not as conquest, but as trust. Governance can be built on African traditions of consensus, accountability, and service. Elections can become less about tribes and bribes, more about ideas and responsibility. To get there, though, Africans must shed the garments that do not fit. They must weave their own, stitched with their own history, colored with their own values, designed for their own people. And this is where the voice of new leaders matters. Men like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso dare to ask the forbidden question: must democracy always look like Europe's? Or can Africa chart its own system, one that resists violence, restores dignity, and protects sovereignty? For some, that vision is dangerous. For others, it is long overdue. But the choice cannot be postponed. The time is now. So I leave you with these questions. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies of reform truly mark the beginning of a new democratic model? Or will he, like Lumumba and others before him, pay the price for defying the script? Can we continue to trust him to carry the torch, or must Africa prepare new hands to take it up? Your voice matters. Please share your thoughts in the comments because debate is the first step toward redefinition. Share this video if you believe Africa must no longer be a passive student of imported systems, but an architect of its own. And subscribe if you believe that truth, even when uncomfortable, is more important than headlines. The future of Africa's democracy is not only a political question, it is a human one, and it is one that cannot wait.